Hello, everyone. We are back for another episode of Beyond the Whistle. This will be episode 14, and we're joined by a very special guest today. It is the Giants athletic writer, Dan Duggan. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Of course. So I'm Dylan Pescatore. As you guys know, I'm joined by Ian Nicholas and Cortland Parrott. You guys, we are ready for episode 14, and let's start off with a question on everyone's mind. Dan, how are you doing through these tough times with the pandemic going on?
Doing pretty well. As I told you guys before we started recording, I'm doing this in my bathroom because my 2-year-old daughter's napping. So trying to keep it quiet in a 2-bedroom apartment. But otherwise, everything's going pretty well. I mean, she's work from home experience a little bit different, but it's been a lot of fun, really. So there's been some silver linings to it.
And you've covered, like we were talking about before, you cover mostly the Giants. But we want to go back. What got you into journalism and sports? What was that early age like?
Man, you have to go like all the way back. Like I think journal from first grade was like an early foray into sports writing. You know, every other kid was probably writing about their favorite toy, and I was writing about like detailed breakdowns of the Celtics game that I watched the night before, or the Red Sox game. I grew up in Boston. So I was always super into sports, and probably at some point in maybe high school or maybe a little earlier, I realized probably wasn't going to become a professional athlete.
Mm-hmm.
And so sort of just married the two, where I was pretty good writer and liked doing that, loved sports, so just figured if I couldn't play them, writing about them was the next best thing.
So yeah, and that's what you did. You went to UMass at Amherst. You stayed in Massachusetts, and after there, you wrote for the Boston Herald, and as well as the New York Times to start your career as a freelance writer. So what was that moment like when you were first starting out your career, writing for the biggest paper in Boston in your hometown, covering sports, which seems like a win-win for what you wanted to do with your career?
Yeah, no, it was a great opportunity. I actually I worked at the student newspaper at UMass, and just kind of got lucky, which is, if you to go through my story or whatever, you're going to find that to be the case a lot of times. Timing is everything. And my senior year at UMass in the spring, I actually wanted to cover the baseball team because I was more of a baseball fan.
Mm-hmm.
But my friend Jeff Howe, who actually covers the Patriots for The Athletic, he had covered the lacrosse team the year before, and he was like, listen, the lacrosse team is way better to cover. Baseball plays like double headers all weekend. You'd be at the field like, senior year in college, you don't spend like 15 hours a weekend watching kind of crappy A-10 baseball. So he's like, lacrosse team is good. Just trust me. They play like once on Saturday afternoon. It's a much, I didn't know anything about the sport at all. Kind of jumped on, and he helped me learn the ropes, and just got fortunate that they went on a run to the national championship, which was like totally unprecedented. I mean, it's always like the same 4 teams, and somehow UMass broke through that year. And it just worked out that I had sort of been in, very, loose contact with the Herald my senior year, like everyone trying to line something up. And yeah. I just asked if they wanted me to freelance the Final Four and the national championship game for them. They kind of
they weren't going to send someone down to Philly to cover the lacrosse Final Four. But since I was already going and paying my own, we're happy to throw me a few bucks. And more importantly for me, it was just kind of get a little exposure and get my foot in the door. And so I didn't, I graduated spring of 2006, and then the fall of 2006, I got hired just lowest man on the totem pole. My first gig was just answering the phone on Friday nights, taking high school football scores. But again, that was just a foot in the door, and just kind of carved out a niche. Like the first assignment I had was covering the UFC. I did a notebook every other Sunday. Just like lacrosse, I knew nothing about the UFC, but they offered it, so I accepted it and became an expert as fast as I could. And then just really filled in the blanks because newspapers obviously were kind of short-staffed in the last decade, and only gets worse. So anytime they needed somebody, I would just kind of step up. And by the end of my time there, I was there 6 years. I was really sort of like the utility man. Like I would go season to season as the extra guy with they go from the Celtics to the Red Sox to the Patriots. And just always be like the third or fourth guy when someone had a day off that needs someone to step in. That was kind of my role. So it was really about just getting opportunities. It didn't hurt that the Boston teams were very successful during that stretch, so it got me a little more exposure, and I was able to make some connections just by sharing press rooms with some national people and whatnot. But it was really just like I said, with timing and just working hard, and was able to just sort of carve out my own niche and sort of break through a little bit in the 6 years I was there.
Always hear about taking every opportunity that is presented, and after your 6 years, you moved to New York. We always hear about the Boston-New York sports rivalry. Is there a change? We always hear about how the New York media excuse me, New York media is so, judged, and there's a different culture around there. Did you feel that when you moved from Boston to New York?
I don't think so. I mean, I think if I moved from, Oklahoma City or even like LA or something, you might feel it. But Boston's pretty intense and pretty crazy. It's a little bit different because in Boston, there's only the one team in every sport. So everyone you're a Patriots fan, you're a Celtics fan, you're a Red Sox fan. It's a little different here where there's divides. I mean, there's people in New York who hate the Giants or hate the Yankees. Obviously in Boston, you don't get that. So it's almost, I would say it's more passionate in Boston, but everyone is just locked in to your team. Like, again, there's people who don't even probably care about the Giants in, my backyard here, which is kind of interesting. But no, I think they're both super intense. You probably throw Philly in there. Like, those three markets are all pretty crazy. I don't know if I would, I haven't been a ton of exposure to Philly, but from everything I've seen and heard, it definitely belongs in that conversation. But I wouldn't say that New York has been any different than Boston, and especially, when you're talking about having all these different teams, it almost like the crowds might be bigger in a Patriots locker room on a random Thursday afternoon because it's the only show in town. Whereas here you have, media, Jets practice, Giants practice. The two baseball teams, one of them might be in the playoffs. So yeah, I would say it's the same volume, obviously, because there is a ton of media down here. But yeah, Boston was pretty good training ground. It wasn't like I came to New York. I was like, oh wow, this is so intense. And God, it was coming from a pretty intense place, going to a pretty intense place.
And you said you grew up in Boston. You were a Boston fan, Red Sox. Myself, I'm a Red Sox fan, Patriots, the Celtics, the whole 9 yards. Going to New York, there's always that New York-Boston rivalry. What was your opinion on how covering the teams that, the teams that you're rooting against didn't really like? Was it just a job to you, or was there some kind of like, I don't know if I want to do this?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I always, the example I give to people, and that kind of clicks for them, because I get that question all the time, is like, so when I was the backup guy with the Patriots for a couple of years, I was covering Bill Belichick every day. Like, you go to a Bill Belichick press conference every day, that's going to beat the fan out of you really fast, because you ask a question, he either mumbles or bites your head off, or just, it's not like, oh, this is so fun talking to Bill Belichick. I mean, there's obviously, maybe the first time you were in the locker room, like, Tom Brady or something, that was kind of cool because I was, young enough that I was a fan while he was, maybe winning his first couple of Super Bowls. But yeah, the fandom really gets beaten out of you pretty fast. So definitely when I first came down here, a lot of my friends and family back home, like, how can you cover the Giants? Like, they beat the Patriots. But even by the time the Patriots were playing in those Super Bowls, I wasn't like a diehard Patriots fan. I'd rather see the Patriots win the Super Bowl than like the Colts. But at the end of the day, if I'm at the game, it didn't really matter. So yeah, the Giants, I mean, listen, it's definitely like just a job, and I don't say that like dismissively because it's a great job, and there's only 32 NFL teams to cover, and they're probably one of the premier ones to cover. So I'm super happy to it, but it doesn't make a difference. If I was covering the Patriots, I wouldn't be rooting from the win, and cover the Giants, I don't root from the lose. I think it's a cliche for like reporters to say like they don't root, but it's really kind of true. Like it just becomes a job. You're dealing with these guys every day. You have interpersonal relationships. So some players you like, some players you don't. And it's more based on their personalities than how they play on the field. Whereas a fan, you're just living and dying by who's a good player, who's a bad player. It's kind of a totally different perspective when you're in the locker room around these guys all the time.
So as a Giants fan myself, I love reading your articles and how in depth you go. I mean, I know the draft obviously was a big break for sports fans in general. I mean, now you get to write articles about the Giants draft selections, the undrafted free agents they're signing. A lot of new talent is coming into a really young and talented team that hasn't had a lot of team success over the years. But I'm just curious, since you are from New England, you are from the Boston area, can you tell Giants fans anything about new head coach Joe Judge? I mean, he's 38 years old. He was with the Patriots from 2012 to 2019. And I know special teams coaches don't get a whole lot of time with the media up there in Boston. And he's not a big name like Matt Patricia or Josh McDaniels or Brian Flores that has come out of New England. But can you tell the Giants fans a little bit about the special teams coordinator who will be heading the team whenever we get football back?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I think he got hired on January 8th. On January 7th, I didn't know a heck of a lot about him. I moved down to New York in 2012. I think that was his first year in New England, so we barely overlapped. And certainly as like the third guy in the beat, I wasn't dealing with the special teams coordinator, even if we did overlap for a couple of weeks. So yeah, I mean, it's funny. One of my first stories I wrote was like, who is Joe Judge? And I tracked down a bunch of people from his background, coaches who were sort of mentors to him, peers. But it wasn't like that was just me. I mean, nobody knew who he was. I mean, when his name came out on the list of candidates, if you were ranking him 1 to 6 or 7, however many candidates they had, he was 6 or 7. I mean, he was completely an afterthought, 38-year-old special teams coordinator. Nobody thought he was going to get the job. And obviously, he blew them away in the interview, had the recommendations from Belichick and Saban. And now you see how he's, handled his media interviews. You can see why he would have been impressive behind closed doors. I mean, he's definitely a very strong personality, a very detail-oriented guy. You hear that, all the time. You can't really get to that level if you're like sloppy, but he seems like he's heightened in terms of that. Like I think that preparation and all that stuff is going to be pretty intense under him. I don't think he's going to run a really relaxed, team. I think it's going to be pretty business-like. And so, I've gotten to know him a little bit. I think it'll be different once we actually, hopefully soon, or at some point, get around each other every day because, he does an interview here and there, and it's a lot of the same talking points because, they haven't really done much, talking a little bit about that, but for the most part, it's just been the same message he gave from his introductory press conference. So we'll get to know him a lot better, I think, once we get into training camp again, presuming we have one. And then the season, listen, anyone can ace the job from January to August, but once the Bulls start flying in the fall, you find out what the guy's made of. But he's been very impressive to this point, but I certainly can't say that I knew a heck of a lot about him, more than anyone else did until around early January when his name first came on the radar.
I want to go back to that draft, which was virtual, and really how you've been connecting with the players, how they had their interviews on Zoom, the coach had their interviews on Zoom who were coming in. How has it been different from just meeting them in person and talking to them? Has it been tough? Has it been hard to get information that sometimes you got last year or years prior?
It's funny because really, there's never a good time for this to happen. But if you're in the NFL, it kind of happened at the best possible time. It didn't interrupt the season. Obviously, if you're talking about any of the other major sports, either the playoffs would be going on right now or baseball would be starting. So football, there was all the kind of hand-wringing, but should they do free agency? Should they do the draft? But I think it was probably the right call because really nothing changed dramatically. Granted, the kind of nuts and bolts of how the draft was executed changed, but the same thing happened that happens every other year. It's just they were doing it from their home office on Zoom rather than, sitting in a war room and making the picks that way. But from my perspective, really nothing has changed drastically yet because, free agency is always done from home. The big difference for me is, like I said, my 2-year-old's home with me, so I got to try and work during nap time, whereas usually should be at daycare and I'd have 8 hours to get stuff done. So that's been a little bit of a challenge. But no, free agency, that's all, over the phone and texting and calling people. The draft, even that, we go to the facility usually for the draft. We sit in the media room, watch it on TV like everyone else, and then we go down to an auditorium for a press conference. Instead, I watched it at home and jumped on a Zoom call after. So really no different. It'll become more of a difference even now. There'll be OTAs and mini camps will be coming up. And you get access to those. So you definitely miss some of that. But a lot of that, in the spring, there's nothing too hard hitting. Once camp starts, around the end of July, early August, that's when we'll start to really feel it. If there isn't access, because even if they have camp, there's probably a pretty good chance they're not going to be doing daily media. I'm sure they're going to limit the amount of people they expose themselves to. So if we're not there day in and day out like you are in camp, watching practice, talking to players, talking to coaches, that's how you start to develop relationships and really get to know what's going on with the team. That will be a challenge, and that will be very different. But yeah, honestly, it's whatever, we're 2-3 months into this, it hasn't been that much different just because of the way it fell on the NFL's calendar.
Mm-hmm. And you talk a lot about talking to players, interviewing players. And what is a key to someone to asking those good questions that will get the good answers you're looking for? Do you have any tips or anything like that you can share?
Everyone obviously has their own style, so I think that's the first thing. You can't try to do it the way someone else does it. But I think the big kind of learn is to not try to ask a good question in a way. You want to make things as conversational as possible. So I don't want to make it. It's tough when I hear someone basically read a rehearsed question or read off a notepad. You should kind of have it be a little more natural because that's how you're going to get a more natural response. The question doesn't really matter. Obviously you have to phrase it in a certain way but it's more what they're going to say back. So there's different ways to go about getting a good answer. I think one of the things I've tried to do and I've learned is actually kind of less is more. I hear sometimes a lot of people ask a question and they basically provide the answer they want to hear, or they provide 2 options. Just ask a question point blank and let them take it from there. Leave it open-ended rather than trying to you probably have in your mind a lot of times, I'm going to put this quote in my story right here. It's well, then you're just fishing for that quote. You're better off kind of going broad. And then if they answer it a certain way, you can narrow it down with follow-up questions. But I think that's the biggest thing is I try not to you got to think. You got to do the research. And if I talk to somebody, I'm going to do the research beforehand. But once we start talking, I'll have some notes jotted down just so I don't miss a topic or forget, I want to ask them about this. But I think the best way to do it is just make it natural and sort of free flowing. You know, like the way we're talking now, you're going to get better answers from someone if it's a little more comfortable than if you just like we're reading question 1, question 2, question 3. If then you're not listening, I think that's the biggest thing. You have to listen to what the person's saying. That's something I always find myself doing because I'll have those little notes like, oh, I want to ask him about this. Meanwhile, he's saying something, and I listen back. Like, oh man, I kind of missed that he said this one little nugget that I wish I followed up on. I think listening is really more important than actually, how you phrase the question or the way you ask a question.
So I guess to follow up to that, over your years covering the Giants, who are some of the guys, big names or smaller names on the roster that you've had the most fun talking to? Who are like the most approachable guys that you've built a good chemistry with over the years that you just appreciate, sitting down and talking football with them?
That's a good question. I mean, I will say that, they've had a pretty good locker room in my time, even though it's changed a lot. And obviously, made about Gettleman has tried to bring in a lot of high character guys, and that's been the case. Really, hasn't been any problems. And obviously, there's that 2017 year where things went sideways. But so there's definitely some guys I wouldn't put on the list of my favorites. But as far as the guys I really liked, I mean, Landon Collins probably stands out as the best because the way it works in the NFL is certain players only have to talk once a week. Like Odell had that treatment. Saquon sort of has that treatment now. Quarterbacks a lot of times will have that, although Eli was a little more, did a little extra. But for the most part, like the biggest stars are like once a week guys. I mean, Landon Collins was in the Defensive Player of the Year running that 2016 season, the Pro Bowler. Yep. He was a 4 times a week guy. He was there every time you needed him.
Wow.
After games, he'd always stand up, be accountable. And like he's gotten himself into trouble. I know Giants fans have kind of turned on him. And he's, the thing is he's just unfiltered. So when he's on your team, you like it. But now he's in Washington and he's taking shots at Gettleman. I understand why Giants fans don't like it. But again, to the fan part of the question earlier, as a media member, I just want guys who are honest. I don't want the canned answers and stuff. So he was always just brutally honest, candid, told you what was on his mind. I really liked covering Odell. I mean, I know he's another really super polarizing guy. Mm-hmm. But you talk to people around him, they never really had bad things to say about him. It was always sort of the outside perception of, oh, he's a distraction, he's this and that. But when you were around him and spoke to him, he was an intelligent guy. Like he can't, I'll put it this way, he can't help himself. But he's his own worst enemy sometimes. He does stuff that, whether it's after the national championship game with the money to players, like he's all putting himself in the public eye a lot of times in ways that aren't smart, reflect poorly on him. But the thing that's almost more puzzling about it is he's not like a dumb guy. Like you see him do some dumb things, but you talk to him and he's a very intelligent person. But he was just, he's like, you always like to cover stars because people are interested in them. So, but stars can be jerks. And I just didn't feel like he was. I didn't feel like the perception of him matched up to what my interactions were with him. I mean, listen, he could be moody, and there were some days he was good, some days he was bad. And but I thought on the whole, he was a very interesting guy to cover. And then, I mean, I don't want to go through the whole, but there's a lot of guys beyond that, just like the everyday guys that are just really good, solid people. You like guys who you can just have a conversation with. It's not always about football. I was a kid, and there's plenty of guys like that. You have 53 guys in the locker room, so you kind of have all levels. You got the $20 million superstars on to the undrafted free agents. So there's all walks of life are kind of represented. And there's definitely a lot of good just down to earth guys. But as far as like 2 bigger name guys, they stand out as some of the more interesting ones and more entertaining ones that I've had to cover.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, talking to people about topics other than football is so important. And I especially like the articles that don't really talk about the game that's going on, but more like a personal life story, or maybe something happened as a child and it's now coming back up. How do you feel about writing those stories that aren't necessarily about a guy who had 2 touchdowns, but it's more about his personal life? Do you enjoy those more than the game? How is that balance?
Yeah, I mean, balance is probably a good word because, you don't want to be sitting there writing about all, heartfelt stories when like you still got to cover the games and cover who's playing well. But no, I definitely try to mix those in as much as possible. And it's interesting. A lot of times the comments are like, oh, it's like so cool to see like this human side of them. It's like, I think a lot of times it's easy to just look at them as like they're football players. And then you realize, no, there's a lot of them have a lot more going on behind the scenes. And so when you get a guy to open up and talk about that stuff, that's always very interesting and definitely something I like to do. And that even comes from all the conversations you have off the record where they just get to trust you get to know each other. I wrote a story last year, Eli Penny, the fullback,
yep,
and 2 family members murdered in a 1 week span out in LA.
Wow.
And I had no idea that happened, but he just made a comment one time that he had to go home for some family situation. And we have a pretty good relationship. And just, he kind of mentioned what happened, and then I was like, well, that's like an unbelievable story if you want to talk. But at the time, we're just talking, man to man, like it wasn't with a recorder on. And he was like, sure. And then so he really opened up and talked about his, upbringing in South Central LA and, having family members murdered and stuff. It was really heavy stuff, but it was great to be able to tell his story and, all that he's overcome. And so, yeah, those types of stories are great when the opportunity presents. But there are times where, hey, like Saquon Barkley rushes for 2,000 yards or whatever, you can just write that too. Like you can just write about the football part too. You don't want to go too overboard. So like I said, the balance aspect of your question definitely applies.
And we see in the locker rooms a lot, especially around superstars, there's that big horde of, microphones and notebooks and reporters. How can you sit down with a player in those media sessions when they only talk 2 to 3 times a week where you can have that personal conversation? Or is it a group conversation with a bunch of reporters? How does that work?
Well, it's funny. I'm fortunate at The Athletic where I don't have to go to Saquon Barkley's weekly press conference and just report whatever he says. Because that's how it was with Odell. Like anything he said was news. And I used to be on NCTV.com where it's a little more click driven. So I have to, Odell said this, that's my story. I'm looking for kind of different angles at The Athletic. So in some ways, those scrums are because while 30 reporters are crowded around Saquon's locker, I can peel off and go talk to Sterling Shepard, or Daniel Jones over there. Let me just run and grab him and ask him a question, or just shoot the breeze with them. So I actually use that to my advantage. I love when there's big scrums. I mean, again, there are times where, and maybe as a team that's better, I've covered them at The Athletic for 2 seasons. They've been very good. When they get better in the games, the stakes are a little higher for the games. I might need to be at Saquon's because what he says might still be the biggest story of the day. Well, the team isn't doing that well. You're not really covering the X's and O's in November of a 2-9 team. So yeah, I would use that time when there's a big scrum going on to sort of work the peripheral. But you can't lose sight of people still want to hear about Saquon more than they want to hear about the backup left tackle or whatever. So as much as those human interest stories might be great, you still need to cover the stars. So yeah, you have to pick your spots. I'll go to Saquon, maybe ask a question or two just so you see my face and hear my voice. And then later in the week, you see him passing through the locker room. And you're like, hey, you got a minute for this? So it's definitely harder to develop relationships with those guys who are just – because I might be saying, I'm going to get him later in the week to ask him one question. Well, 10 other people want to do the same thing. So for him, it's not one question. It's 10 questions. So, you have to pick your spots. You don't want to – it's kind of a fine line of developing those relationships. And I think it's really helpful to get to see them outside the locker room, whatever that is. They have a camp. They do a public relations appearance, whatever it is. Try to get to as many of those too, because that's the time where A, they'll recognize, oh wow, you went out of your way to come to this, and B, it's a little more relaxed setting, and there's not 10 other reporters lining up to ask them one question, and you might be like, oh god, I don't want to sit here and go through another media scrum. So, but yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a big part of navigating a locker room, a big part of being a beat reporter.
So, I mean, you've mentioned Saquon Barkley so much because he's not all of a sudden become the guy for the Giants, but, with Eli retiring and Odell being shipped to Cleveland, he has become that guy that Giants fans want to hear. And this is a very young team. I mean, there's maybe 1 or 2 players over the age of 30 on the roster. And for you, since you've covered this team so in depth, going through really the entire 53-man roster, or right now a 90-man roster, what were your first impressions of the Giants draft, this year? I mean, in the voids that they needed to fill, from Andrew Thomas, Xavier McKinney, Matt Pert, who, is from UConn and we're from Connecticut, and then Darnay Holmes in the 4th round. What do you think of some of those young guys who the Giants are bringing into already a very young team, and what Giants fans should look out for with these guys whenever we're back on seeing them live on TV?
I think Thomas, it was kind of like flip a coin. I mean, you talked to a million different people before the draft, and they had a different order of those top 4 guys. Everyone had their personal taste, but I think the thing you heard a lot with him is he's the most NFL ready. Obviously, schooled in the SEC, so you can't fault that pick. I mean, he's left tackle by trade. There's no projecting there, so I think it made a lot of sense because listen, they certainly need to address the tackle position. Nate Solder wasn't the answer. And even if he was, he's getting up there. So they need to have someone in the pipeline. So as much as a lot of fans want Isaiah Simmons, and listen, if he turns out to be as good as everyone thinks, maybe they look back and regret that. But I think the position they're in, you got Daniel Jones, you got Saquon, they needed to address the offensive line. And so again, if it's Thomas better than Mekhi Becton and better than Tristan Wirfs, I don't know. That'll be determined. Mm-hmm. But I think it totally made sense to get a tackle there. You have to believe that he'll be ready to step in from day one, because if he can't beat out like a Nick Gates or Cam Fleming, that's not a great sign. So I think you have to count on him being ready from day one. McKinney, you hear from them that they thought he was a first-round pick, and they consider it a steal. I mean, listen, it's a spot where he can certainly step right in because they didn't really have much at that safety spot next to Peppers. So you have to feel good about his chance of contributing from day one. I think with Parrott, they're definitely looking at him as a developmental guy. I'm very surprised if he might not see the field all season, and that's fine because you have Solder, you have Thomas, you have Cam Fleming.
Yeah.
So he can take a year behind the scenes, and then Holmes is another guy I think can definitely step right in. That slot corner spot has been a weakness for a couple of years now. So I think you could definitely have 3 of your top 4 picks, if not starting, with Holmes playing big roles. And then anything beyond that, it's really, you're just hoping someone sticks out. I know everyone's really excited about the guard Lemieux in the 5th round. I mean, we'll see. I mean, yeah, I get it. Like, he played a lot at good school and has, gotten a lot of good reviews. But how often do 5th round picks really pan out? I mean, they might have got pretty lucky last year with Slayton and Conley looked like pretty good 5th round picks. So if they could ever kept run on 5th round picks, they'd really be ahead of the game. So I think he's another guy like Parrott, though, who would be more like down the line. I mean, Zeigler and Hernandez are there. I don't think Lemieux will be the starting center this year, but you never know. In a year or two, maybe he steps in and they found something there. Because listen, this team's had a long run of missing on draft picks. If they can start to hit on some of these guys, certainly would help turn the tide.
Definitely.
For sure. I wanted to end it off with more of a journalism question. You work for The Athletic right now, and we all hear and we all read The Athletic and how big of a newspaper it's began. You started at NJ.com. You talked about how you got to be more of a clickbait kind of guy because you're not at a national platform like The Athletic is. Just talk about how you've transitioned. Now you're 2 years with the Giants and the newspaper, how big it's become and how great it is for you to work on such a platform.
Yeah, I mean, it was fortunate when it kind of came around when it did. I was looking to see what else might be out there, and then The Athletic came around. And it was definitely a place that I think a lot of journalists wanted to work. And I was fortunate that there wasn't like an application process, an interview process. They sort of targeted who they wanted. So, they had their eyes on me for whatever reason. And I was happy to answer the call. And yeah, it's been great. I mean, I just passed my 2-year anniversary there. And it felt a little bit during the interview process. It was like a little too good to be true. But, 2 years in, it's definitely lived up to what I expected. Like I said, I don't have to just Odell said this. I got to run something, write something about it. Clickbait is almost too strong a term because listen, at the end of the day, if you work at a site that is based on advertising, you need to produce stuff that people want to read. Like that's just the nature of the business. I mean, you can obviously go too far with it, and be like the clickbait, but it's just, if you're working at NJ.com, you have to produce 3 or 4 stories a day because their whole model is built around people clicking and getting advertisers, eyeballs for advertisers. So at The Athletic, we don't have that. It's obviously much more, quality driven, which of course anyone wants to work at a place like where that's the case. And it's been great. I mean, I've had a lot more freedom to kind of do this type of stories I want to do, not have that same pressure to, again, have to just run with whatever quote was said at the podium or anything like that. I get the time to sink my teeth into story ideas. So it's been great. And obviously the whole media world is kind of in a little bit of a tough spot right now. So let's hope they get the games going back because in some ways we're fortunate that we're not reliant on advertising dollars, but people are still having to dig into their pocket to pay subscription fees. So the longer we go without games, it's not going to be good for anybody. So I hope we get games to cover again real soon. And that way The Athletic can kind of continue the trajectory it's been on.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed talking to you as you are someone who digs deeper than the game. You also look at the game, but you also dig deeper. And you're really in the mecca of media and sports in New York. So I've certainly enjoyed talking to you and learning more about the journalism industry, especially in New York.
Yeah, no, it was fun to doing this. I hope you guys picked up some little nuggets along the way. A lot of people helped me when I was your age starting out. So hopefully I can kind of pay it forward and hopefully help you guys out as you make your own trail.
We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been an honor and really just thank you again. I mean, it was great to hear all the notes and through all of episodes, we've had guests and really, to be honest, you've been our best one with advice. So really just thank you one more time. And it's been Beyond the West Hill episode 14. Dylan Pescatore, Ian Nicholas, Cortland Parrott, and Dan Duggan. Thank you guys for watching.